Very special thanks to Barrow Motors of Burnham-on-Sea in Somerset for providing the vehicle in this review, and of course, as always, I like to drop a link to their website right below this video in the description. If you want to, for example, inquire about a vehicle such as this one or others, check out their current stock, or even contact them about anything in general, then of course you can find all of those details via the link below. This installment of Beards and Cars has been a very long time coming, and it's no exaggeration for me to say that this is literally a bucket list review for me. This is one of the 10 cars which I wanted to review on the channel the most, which probably sounds crazy given the kind of other vehicles that we've talked about, but that's the kind of love that I have for the Panda 100HP, and I so desperately hoped that it would live up to my expectations of it. It's not exactly like the car had a massive amount to live up to, and for a vehicle which is among the least powerful and slowest that I've talked about, it's actually one of the most enjoyable, and it's also one of the cars out of this entire series which other motoring journalists and magazines have actually given the most praise to. If I recall correctly, I believe Evo magazine, which is one of the first places I saw this car back when it came out, I'm pretty sure they gave it their Car of the Year award. And even though it's only the middle of January when releasing this video, this car is definitely in contention for me as well. Now, of course, we'll have to see how the year plays out, but what is there to be said about this car that hasn't already been said? Chances are, if you're watching this review, you're probably at least interested in buying one or are a fan of the vehicle in general, as I am. You already know, for example, that it has 100 horsepower. That's kind of obvious. It has that from a 1.4 litre engine, it has just under 100 pound-feet of torque, which is just over 130 newton meters, for those who prefer that. 0 to 60, about 9.5 seconds, flat out about 115 miles an hour. The fuel economy, as you'd expect, is very, very good. Around town it's quoted at like 33 to the gallon, about 53 on the motorway, and averages out to about 44. And according to aggregator sites like Honest John, the majority of owners average out to about 40 to the gallon in practice. And of course that will vary depending on how you drive it. None of the parts on this car are particularly expensive. This example even is about £3,500 for the whole car. You can buy them for even less, you can pay a little bit more if you want to. And there's usually at least a handful of nice examples on the market, at least here in the UK at any given time. So all of these things are probably what many of you would already know. So what is there to still talk about? What is there that's fresh? What is there that maybe you hadn't considered? Well, the number one thing to me that I love about this car, and this is the main thing that I wanted it to live up to, is how much of an unapologetic throwback the Panda 100HP is to, I would argue, the origins of the hot hatch. Because if you think back to some of the most iconic OG hot hatches, like the late 70s Golf GTI, the 80s, for example, Renault 5 or Peugeot 205 GTIs and GTs, and even the rally homologation turbos, etc. These cars, more often than not, with the exception of those rally evolutions, weren't really trying to be the fastest thing around. They were quick, but they weren't even aiming for supercars. Nowadays, you can buy Mercedes A-Class AMGs that can do 0 to 60 in less than 4 seconds. Straight out of the factory. And as we move more and more into the electric car category, that's going to continue. In fact, before too long, we are going to have hot hatches that can do 0 to 60 in sub 3 seconds from brand new. That's all well and good. And yet, the fastest hot hatches that I've driven have actually tended to be the ones that were the least interesting. It was the ones that had the most personality and the most character, which were really the truest to what, let's be honest, you want from a hot hatch. Because when purchasing a hot hatch, it kind of falls into a category of vehicle that most other performance cars, if you think about it, actually don't. If you go out to buy a supercar, well, chances are you probably want something that is the best at something. Most of them tend to aim to be top speed, acceleration, lap record of some kind. If you're buying a super saloon, you might want the one with the most power or the most space or the most badge panache. But when buying a hot hatch, I would actually argue, perhaps even more so than any other kind of car, you want fun first, and everything else, including performance, is secondary to that. I believe that some hot hatches have lost their way in that regard. They've gone all in on performance, and they are very fast, but they are simply not as engaging to drive as this car with half, a third, sometimes even a quarter of the power, because it doesn't need more. This is a throwback to those older days, and I also love that it kind of reminds me of the K car market, that's KEI in Japan, where of course they have strict regulations on the size and engine capacity of their vehicles, and these little K cars, these about 650cc, around 60 horsepower turbocharged legends in Japan, which we very rarely see here in England, apart from the occasional Honda Beat or Suzuki Cappuccino, these cars just have so much personality, and because they have less power to work with, you've guessed it, it's one of my favourite catchphrases, but the less power you have, the more of it you can use, and this is a prime example of that. 100 horsepower is more than enough, because in this car, 40 miles an hour feels like 60. 60 feels like 100. It's so good through corners that you barely ever need to realistically brake, even if you don't want to. It feels essentially like playing a racing video game in real life, except it's in a car that costs no more than just an average used car in many cases, even of a similar age and mileage. It has no remarkable particular piece of spec on its entire spreadsheet, beyond the fact that of course it's fairly light. It weighs less than a metric ton at 975 kilos, which for our American friends is well under 2,200 pounds. Well, that means that you can just use all of that fun and get all of that personality all the time. Now, to speak to two other things which I commonly bring up for fairly obvious reasons on the channel, one thing that I always have to talk about in any car is space and comfort, because I'm not the easiest of people to fit in most cars, so does a tiny sub 1 ton car with a little 1.4 litre engine actually suit me? Is it drivable? Would it give me, for example, a bad back? Would it be too cramped for longer journeys? Is it just uncomfortable? How is the ride? Well, simply put, it's fantastic. The seat adjustment is great. You can actually put the seat so far back that I had to put it forward. That's the kind of space that we're talking about. The headroom is great because of that kind of, again, almost K-car shape where the roofline is much higher than you may typically expect, and in terms of headroom, it is easily superior to the Fiat 500, or even the performance-oriented Abarth 595, which of course I already reviewed here on the channel. Now, the Abarth is quicker, but I honestly had more fun in this car and prefer this car, both before and after driving it, to that Abarth. Now, the Abarth currently is the cuter, more high demand and probably more collectible choice. This one to me is more of the pure driver's car. This is one of those cars, in a funny kind of way, similarly to my first car, the Touareg V10, wherein you don't buy it to try and impress someone. You buy it because you know how good it is. You buy it because you want that car. It's not a poser's car. It's not a status car. It's a sleeper. And even though plenty of people could see, oh, that looks like something a little bit special, it's still, at the end of the day, a little Fiat Panda. So it's unassuming, it's relatively simple in its design. I've always loved the look of this car, especially in 100HP form. It's clean, it's classy, and it looks every bit as sporty as it is. It's just the whole package. It's, as I said in the thumbnail, the real personification of less is more. It doesn't need a single horsepower more than it has, and even though of course there are plenty of owners who might up the power or even swap the engine completely as a track day toy, or just because they want maybe 200 horsepower out of it, that's all well and good, and if that's what you want, then sure, go for it. But to me, this is just a car that doesn't really need more power. It's already more than fun enough. The practicality is easily on par with realistically what you'd want from most city cars, vehicles which aren't even attempting performance in any way. So from that regard, well, if you're looking for a tiny little daily runabout, honestly, name a better one than this, especially if you're looking for both the practicality and the performance. This is a genuine little hot hatch. It is a modern classic. Everyone raves about it. Everyone who has the experience enough to know what to compare it to, and not just, somebody who's only driven one or two cars. I'm talking established brands like Top Gear and Evo magazine. Well, if they say it's good, that means something. So yes, it's practical, but it also delivers the goods on the looks, the fun factor, the cornering, and even the performance. On paper, 9.5 seconds doesn't sound quick. In practice, as I mentioned earlier on, it's more than quick enough. And for those who may occasionally drive past someone's house and see maybe a Maserati in the driveway or a Jag XK next to a Panda 100HP, which you will occasionally see, more often than you might think in fact, you're probably wondering, why on earth would they ever have that? Well, actually, it makes a lot of sense to me, even more now that I've driven one. I'm so happy that this car lived up to my expectations, but just before we close out the video, I do of course always like to run through some of the things which you might want to look out for when buying one. Now, the price range on these doesn't vary as crazily as some of the vehicles that we talk about, so you can pretty much find whatever kind of price you want to pay depending on the mileage and the condition, but there are a few things which you'll want to look out for. Some a little bit more serious than others, and these do come from sources who know what they're talking about when it comes to Fiats. Specialists, in fact. The first of these things is the coolant level. Making sure it has the right ratio is important because if not taken care of, that can lead to head gasket issues. So that's not so much a fault, that's more a maintenance kind of thing. Again, as I said with a lot of other cars, just look for evidence of it being loved and treated as it should be. Another thing is the timing belt. Look to make sure that there's no excess slack, and if there is, according to those experts, it's generally better to just replace the chain rather than trying to retension it. The third thing is clutches. It's not necessarily an issue, but these are kind of known, as with a number of other Fiats, for getting through clutches a little bit more quickly than some of their rivals. Again, it is a Fiat, so it's not like it's going to be the most expensive thing in the world anyway. Another thing is tracking. Now, this is one of the issues which you may notice a little bit more often. The tolerances on the tracking on Panda 100HPs, again, as well as a number of other Fiats, tends to be a little bit too broad. The tolerances there are too wide from Fiat, so the general consensus is to aim somewhere in the middle to avoid excess tyre wear. Again, not a fault necessarily, just something to look for evidence of, and if it hasn't been done in the past, maybe look into doing that yourself just to keep on top of it. Another more common issue, you could say, because this is more of an issue, is the dampers. The dampers have a particular weld which can rust and cause a leak via the seal, so that's something which you may want to check out. Look for example, receipts of it having been done in the past, if that has been an issue in the car's history. The rear bump stops for the suspension, not a particularly difficult job to swap those out, but again, something which you will want to check on. And then, of course, being a Fiat, being an Italian car in general, just take a good look around the electronics in general. Lights, for example. Those, though, were the main ones which I could find. And of course, any car, as I've said before, can break down any time. So it would appear that overall, the car has a pretty good history. And thankfully, even if something does break, which is entirely possible, they're not that expensive. In fact, to maintain and run one of these is far more cheap, far more affordable than the vast majority of other cars that I've talked about on the channel. So if you are looking for a genuinely practical daily driver, which can also deliver the smiles, the funky looks, and potentially even the future collector's appeal, because I think these are going to start to become a bit more rare, kind of like the Jag XK in terms of people realising how good they are and then not reselling them. Well, now might be the time to try and snag one up. So overall, that's it for my thoughts on the Panda. I'm so glad to finally get it added to the series. Really a car that I truly can now tick off the bucket list for me personally, and of course, as I said, I'm so glad that it lived up to what I was hoping for. Ultimately, if you want to check out more hot hatch reviews, then I have featured more on the channel, of course in the Beards and Cars series, so you can click through and check those out. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.